Hello again, everyone. We're going to continue now with our Bible class for today. For those of you who are watching this for the first time or haven't been actually in the church with us for this Bible class so far, just a couple of quick introductory points. What we're doing right now is we're going through the books of the Bible, and we've gone through the first 10 books so far, Genesis to 2 Samuel, and our plan is to cover about 1 to 2 books every week or so. This is meant to be an introduction. We're not taking a deep dive into the books. We're not doing a deep amount of individual verse-by-verse study. This is more of an overview to get a sense of the content of the books and to get a sense of the story, the core story of God's love and faithfulness to humanity, and then ultimately manifested in Christ. As part of that, we've been using a series of videos from the Bible Project that talk about the content of these books in a really kind of a nice, effective way. The introductions themselves are very well done normally. Every once in a while, there'll be a little point that we'll talk about. But by and large, they're done very well. The content is very good. And then on top of it, there's this really cool poster that you can take home with you if you're here, or we're going to be linking to the PDF of it in the video so that you have access to it, so that you can see what we're doing here along with the content that we have here as far as the study questions and so forth. So, again, the goal, the idea is to cover in broad strokes the book of 1st and 2nd Kings today, to talk about what's there. And then next week, we'll move on into 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So that's our plan for today. If you have any questions throughout this, again, like for the worship service, feel free to leave your question in the comments on YouTube or in Facebook, and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible with an answer, either right there in the comment section, or maybe perhaps emailing you if an answer needs to be more extensive. So with that, we'll continue, or we'll get into your 1st and 2nd Kings. The first thing we're going to note with 1st and 2nd Kings is that, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, in the original Hebrew Bible, Kings was kings, one big book. The division actually happens that we know of anyway. The division actually happens for the first time in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was done about 200 BC-ish. And what we're doing so that division, 1st and 2nd Kings, that held then through the Vulgate and through most modern translations, even though, again, in the ancient Hebrew Bible, it's just one large work. The work itself covers the period of the very end of David's reign through the end of the last king of Judah, the last king of the southern kingdom. The period of time that we're talking about is approximately 1000 BC, a little after, maybe closer to 950 BC, and then down to about 562. At first, you might go, especially if you know your Bible history dates, you might go, well, Jerusalem fell in 586. That's right. But we actually have a little coda at the end of 2nd Kings about Jehoiakim, the last king, or who would have been the last king of Judah sitting on a throne, and his release from prison. And that would date to about 562, give or take, as best we know. So that the time period that Kings covers, like I said, is a little less than 500 years, about 450 years-ish. And it covers, again, the period really of the entire monarchy of both the north and southern kingdoms. The book continues to be, everything continues to be in chronological order as we had so far with Genesis. The next thing we're going to talk about here real briefly is that, again, like Samuel, we really don't know who the author is. There is some Jewish tradition that points to Jeremiah as possibly being an author. That's probably unlikely, though, mostly because outside of that tradition, we don't really have anything that points to Jeremiah being author. There's nothing internally in the text that seems to really strongly indicate his authorship in terms of style. He's not named as an author anywhere in the Scriptures or by Jesus' New Testament. We just don't really have a good sense of who the author is. Now, that said, whoever the author was somebody who knew their Old Testament, who knew the book of the law. That's something that comes up a number of times in Kings. is the book of the law, and then various citations. One of the stylistic things we're going to see in Kings is that the author seems very concerned about whether or not the king was faithful to the covenant. There isn't a whole lot of time spent on the things that we would normally be interested in as human beings. Like what did they build? Who did they conquer? What were the borders like? How big was the nation and how prosperous at that period? I mean, some of that's mentioned in passing, but really at the core of what Kings is concerned about is whether this king, or this king was faithful or not. And so that brings up some interesting things about the various kings. A couple of examples from the northern kingdom would be Omri and then Jeroboam II. Omri is the father of Ahab. And Omri, even in Assyrian records that we've excavated, Omri is a big deal. His name shows up in a significant way. But he was unfaithful. He was not one who cared about the God of Israel. And he gets a whole of, if I remember correctly, 6 verses. He gets 6 verses for the book of Kings, for as big and as powerful and as secularly successful as he was. An even starker example would be Jeroboam II. As far as we can tell, the northern kingdom under Jeroboam II, that was the biggest, wealthiest, and strongest it was. And Jeroboam reigned for, at least in the ancient world, for a very long time. He reigned for 41 years. And he gets 7 verses. Because he was unfaithful. And the author of Kings wasn't terribly concerned about all the building projects and all the conquests that Jeroboam had. He does mention some of it. But a 41-year reign is crunched down into literally 7 verses. 2 other figures that figure prominently in Kings are Elijah and Elisha. 2 giants of Old Testament prophecy who really did a lot to try to call God's people back, particularly in the northern kingdom where they worked most of the time. Elisha ends up being stationed somewhere near Samaria eventually. Elijah, he's the big opponent to Ahab and Jezebel. Some of the most famous stories of the Old Testament come from Kings. We have Mount Carmel, the showdown on Mount Carmel, where Elijah calls down the fire from heaven on the offering. And then we have the Naboth's vineyard. That happens in Kings. Elisha's raising of the Shunammite son. That happens in 2 Kings, as we have it in our numbering. Elisha's healing of Naaman. That is something that happens in Kings as well. So a lot of big miracles, big Bible stories happen in Kings. I'm going to read here what I have on the sheet here, just again about the coda at the end of the book. The book appears to end somewhat abruptly and quietly with the freeing of Judah's last king, Jehoiachin, from prison. But it's also very consequential and hopeful, for it shows the line of David doesn't just die out in prison. And though the sons of David no longer sit on a physical throne, their lineage will continue until the final messianic king arrives. And then I point you to Matthew chapter 1 for that genealogy, where you can see those names listed. Those names starting or ending with Christ and then going all the way back. So with that, we'll continue with the video. Again, before the video starts, I just want to mention if there's any questions or comments you had about the content we covered so far, or if you have any questions as we're going through the video, again, just feel free to type them in the comments or get a hold of me via email or text. Let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them. So with that, we'll continue with the video.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Although they're 2 separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple than he makes some really horrible choices, and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem, with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20, and then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. The most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elijah. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the Book of Kings.
All right, we're going to walk through a few pieces of the video, a few of the highlights here. And again, if you have the sheet in front of you, or you can pull it up by PDF, I have little timestamps of where in the video we're at. I'll mention that, but you'll have these little timestamps for reference. So right at 25 seconds, it mentions that though Judah in particular had some faithful kings, none of them in the end ultimately fulfilled the Messianic promise. Judah does have some faithful kings. They have generally faithful kings in Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Hezekiah, and Josiah. That's better than obviously, as the video mentioned, that's better than the northern kingdom, which batted a solid 0 for 20. No kings of the north really had anything spiritually speaking redeemable about them, even though there were some from a secular standpoint that were fairly competent and successful. Nobody in the north, as far as the kings went, was faithful to the covenant, though. And eventually, even with these faithful kings of Judah, once those kings die, more often than not, Judah slides right over into some sort of apostasy. So you have, for example, you have Joash, you have Hezekiah, Josiah. Hezekiah, good, faithful king. Followed by Manasseh. Reigned 50 years. Spiritually speaking, an absolute disaster. And even though Josiah, after that, tried to bring the people back, eventually Judah, fairly quickly after that, just gets even worse and rolls over into apostasy, and then the Lord sends in the Babylonians in 586, and the city is finally conquered. 136 starts mentioning the reign of Solomon, and there are a lot of great things about Solomon's reign, especially early on. But even early on, you have a sense that though Solomon in some ways tried to be faithful, in other ways he just got sucked into the quote-unquote world, worldly viewpoints, chasing passion, pleasure, money, profit, power. He starts off well. Right away, he's asking God for wisdom early on, and that's great. In fact, we are blessed with that wisdom in the book of Proverbs, a collection of both Solomon's sayings and also the wise sayings of others, and then the book of Ecclesiastes as well. He also obviously builds the temple, planned and everything put together and set up by his father, and it gets done, and it gets done in a very glorious fashion. But there's a note that the writer of Kings puts in, and I think it's very much on purpose. There's a note that the writer of Kings puts in that is interesting, because I think it's telling because of where Solomon already was going in his heart in some ways. He gets the temple done. He offers this great dedicatory prayer. And then it takes him 13 years. It took him 7 years to build the temple, and it takes him 13 to build his palace. And then we find out shortly after that, on top of it, you can have interesting discussions, obviously, about polygamy in the Old Testament. And I think there's some things to say there. I've mentioned before, again, for those of you who've been in Bible class with me before, I've mentioned that before, one of the things that the Bible does is it has a way of telling stories that I think sometimes is a little lost on Western thinking. Western thinking likes didactic statements. We like to be told, okay, this is right, this is wrong, this is correct, this is bad, and have that just laid out in black and white. One of the things you see in the Old Testament is often a Near Eastern way of telling stories, which is you tell a story, show the consequences, and then let the reader figure it out. So we see that in the chaos of Jacob's family with the multiple wives and the rivalries and all the problems Jacob's family had. We see that in Solomon's father David with the problems his family had. But then Solomon takes all of this, and for all his wisdom and all the great things he accomplishes during his reign, he has, as far as I know, one of the largest harems in the history of the world. He has 700 wives and 300 concubines. It's absolutely mind-bogglingly insane. And it shows up. And I think it shows up in not only how Solomon's reign ends, I think it shows up in how Solomon writes later on in life with Ecclesiastes. I think it shows up in his son Rehoboam. Rehoboam, who, for all the advantages and everything that he had, seemed to have been a fairly oblivious, privileged, in some ways clueless young man. Rehoboam, for all the advantages he had, seems like in some ways like he's kind of what we would call in modern lingo in America a trust fund baby. He's grown up with all this privilege and everything else, and of course, this is the way it should be for me too. And he then walks right into the division of the kingdom. And so, moving on into the next section there, 244, Rehoboam's sad story. It's a story of pride and foolishness. And then his contemporary Jeroboam the first, Jeroboam rebels against Rehoboam's pride and arrogance, but then Jeroboam himself is a sad story of pride and foolishness as he leads the people not just away from the throne of David, but he also leads the people away from God. Jeroboam ends up setting up two temples, Bethel and Dan, to compete with with Jerusalem. He didn't want all his people going down to Jerusalem to worship because, that wouldn't be good. I mean, that would maybe make people think twice about, whether or not we need a divided kingdom or not. So he sets up these 2 temples, and that original sin of Jeroboam becomes then the great problem of Israel for the rest of its existence. The idolatry, the unfaithfulness. 340. I mentioned here it's overly simplistic to say that generally Judah was faithful while Israel was completely apostate. As the video notes correctly, and as you can see in Kings if you read, Judah had plenty of bad kings. They had the good ones I mentioned earlier, but they had plenty of bad ones too. I mentioned one in Manasseh, and there's others as well. Israel, though, never having a faithful king, did have faithful people. They had Elijah, they had Elisha, they had that core faithful remnant there. And I mentioned a couple of places. 1 Kings 19:18, where Elijah is at Horeb, and God mentions that there are thousands. Elijah feels all alone. Lord, there's no one left. I'm it. And the Lord tells him, well, hold on a second, Elijah. There are still thousands of people in Israel faithful. Go minister to them. Go serve them. 2 Kings and 2 and 4 I mentioned here, 2:15 and 4:38, mentioned that company of the prophets that was there with Elisha. Again, there was that faithful core, even faithful core of clergy that were helping to try to keep the people of Israel in the northern 10 tribes faithful. And then one last note that they mentioned in the video, again, very, very correctly, 4:13. Old Testament prophets. Old Testament prophets aren't fortune tellers and primarily people who tell the future. They do sometimes on occasion. There's some really famous Old Testament prophecies that look to the future. Isaiah mentioning Cyrus by name, or 7:14, where the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you'll call him Emmanuel. There is sometimes future telling, but the majority of these guys' lives and work was really similar to what we would see today in a modern parish pastor. They preach, they teach, they call the people to repentance, they seek to lead the people to the Lord God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so primarily these Old Testament prophets are preachers and teachers. Occasionally they do tell the future, but really the primary work of the prophet is to be a spokesman for the God of the covenant, a spokesman for the Lord. A couple of questions that I put on the bottom of the sheet. I'll just read them. I believe in the production we're going to have these questions there for you to see as well, even if you don't download the video, or download the PDF of the sheet. The first question, the most important criteria for a good king in Kings is that he was faithful to the Lord. How can that inform our own definitions of good leadership and good leaders? And if you want to respond to the question or the second one here, again, drop comments down in YouTube and Facebook underneath the video, and we'll do our best to react to them and answer them. The second question is, who are the most memorable kings, good or bad for you, and why? And I'd love to hear what you come up with. Which kings jump out at you? Is either really good or really bad, and why? And what really sticks with you as you read through Kings? Tell us in the comments, and we look forward to hearing and sharing God's word with you again next week.